Oh, you can have your phones out.
No.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through basically a run through of what I had prepared for tonight. It was just really an intro to what we'll be talking about over the course of the week, and the whole idea behind the stuff that I've incorporated in is to help people understand how trauma impacts the brain, body, and the nervous system. We find that people, even first session with clients at our office, we educate them around the common trauma reactions and symptoms, and just with learning that, there's a real reduction in the symptomology because they can start to make sense out of what they're experiencing and feeling. So that's really what today is meant to be, is a little bit of an intro. And we'll be looking at integrative mindfulness and emotional regulation strategies over the course of the next couple of days. And there are just little practical strategies that are built in to help people promote grounding or stimulation if they're feeling too shut down. And yeah, I think that's it. My remote is not cooperating. So let's see, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to take you through a little experiential exercise. This is a technique that Sue and I would use for anyone who decides to do trauma processing, and we teach it in the group just for maximal benefit and also to give you tools right away, because we want to make sure that if participants are coming, that they have resources that they can use really immediately if they're needed. So this is an ocean breathing technique. I know we did some breathing already with Lisa tonight, but this is just short. We're going to do about 4 breaths in and out, so it's not going to be long. This comes from a program called Comprehensive Resource Model, and both Sue and I, and actually all of the therapists at our center, are trained in this, and it's a beautiful internal resourcing model. And the idea behind this is I'm just going to invite you to think of your feelings or emotions that come like a wave, right? So there's a DBT technique that's called Ride the Wave. And it's the idea that our feelings and thoughts are constantly changing, but a lot of times we get stuck and we perseverate, right? So something will come up, typically a triggering thought, and we'll get stuck in it and loop and loop and loop, and it feels like it's going on forever. But if we can learn how to notice that, right? Name, okay, I'm feeling some fear, this is where it comes from, breathe through that, then it will typically subside. And then something else comes in to replace it. So maybe relief, maybe, another thought that we need to ride that wave with, whatever it may be. So I'm just going to invite you to practice. We're going to breathe in to about the count of 5 through the nose and out through the mouth to about the count of 5. So it's just really trying to extend the inhale. Unlike the stuff we did with Lisa, we're not going to do a pause. Quite often I don't teach pauses. And I get that your breathing techniques are a little different. The reason I don't teach them is because trauma breath is often, right, and people are holding their breath and they're in that kind of panicked state, and that tends to just kind of accelerate things. So we want to teach people to keep the breath moving so that, they can keep that regulation going. So there's a natural pause that happens between our in-breath and our out-breath, and that's all that we're looking for, is just breathing in slowly to the count of 5, breathing out slowly to the count of 5. And if you want to imagine, waves rolling in and rolling out, you can do that. And I also give people the analogy that waves, especially if you've seen ocean waves, sometimes feel like they're going to take us under, right? Sometimes they're really, really big. And a lot of times our feelings may feel that way as well. So it's just understanding that the waves do ebb and flow. They do eventually settle, right? And it's helping ourselves to kind of move through that when the big waves come on. So I'll just invite you to nice slow breath in to the count of 5 through your nose and out through your mouth. This will be good after writing the chapter for some of us. That was an adventure that got our heart rate up. But cool. And just noticing. So just noticing even what happens in your body as you're taking that breath in and releasing it out. And then we'll finish off with that one. One of the techniques that you can do to further deepen this, and this has worked, so at our center we work with a lot of really complex trauma. So we don't work with the cream of the crop population. We work with people with addictions. We work with people who are homeless. We work with people who are being trafficked or exploited. We work with veterans. We work with EMS, first responders, all of those different areas. But we, largely work with people who have extensive layers of trauma from childhood. So helping them to find techniques that they can use to stabilize when those emotions are really intense. And I think for veterans, when we're looking at veterans, what we really need to remember, again, is the transition to home, because that's where a lot of the problems happen. And we have people transition home, they're still living in that state of active high arousal, and then they're exploding and flipping their lid, right? And then we see big kind of anger or, sometimes even harm that's happening in the families. So teaching them how to kind of notice that activation and breathe through whatever is coming up while reframing, though, I know where this is coming from. That's there, right, in the workplace. This is here, and being able to recognize and differentiate that can be a really important tool. The other thing that people have done that they've found really helpful is they'll add on a bilateral tapping. So you can do it on your shoulders or you can do it on the outside of your knees, but the idea is tapping right, left, right, left. And we don't just tap anything in, because it actually is stimulating both sides of the brain, so it really helps to integrate it. But for example, we tapped this morning after the snake left. So I was like, oh, look at that. A snake came by the door and we're okay. Let's tap that in. Because that's what we want our brain to receive. Now when I'm thinking about the snake, there's no activation that's coming up for me, right? Because that's been integrated in a way that makes sense for me. And Sue was like, well, I've had a fear of snakes, but now, I saw one and that was really neat. Mm-hmm. I said, tap that in, mm-hmm. right? So we tap in the stuff that we want to resource install and that we really want our brain to hold and embody, not just up here. Because you work with people, right, that know that they're safe. They know when they go home, there's safety. Mm-hmm. But here in the body and in the threat detection part of the brain, it doesn't, right? And it's still responding as though there is active threat. So teaching them how to fluidly breathe through what's coming up while perhaps tapping through seems to contain and distract with intense emotions, but it's also a great resource for installing the thoughts, the new cognitions, the experiences that we have that we want to kind of hold. So that's your technique for the night. We work from the premise of understanding affect regulation and the window of tolerance. So I kind of spoke to this briefly, and the idea behind this is just understanding that we're all born with an optimal arousal zone. This would be kind of your area here. And really what we're meant to do is just to be able to ebb and flow, right? So we're meant to kind of ebb and flow within that normative range. And there might be things that bring us close to the point of having too much anger, too much anxiety, too much fear, even maybe too much excitement. But generally we still re-regulate. Or there might be times that we come too close to the edges of being shut down, right? Too much sadness, too much exhaustion. Maybe we're really, really overtired, or we're really sad because there's been a loss. We'll be talking about grief and loss, so that's an example for sure. But we still tend to re-regulate and ebb and flow. But with trauma, what we know is it drastically sends us outside of that window of tolerance, and people get stuck on, or they get stuck on off, or more often they're oscillating between the two. So if I'm stuck on, just think of too much. There's excessive energy. You know how you can feel that energy in your body when your heart's pounding or when you've got that adrenaline going? Anger, right? Fear. All of that stuff is like your body just being full with too much energy, right? And we want to discharge it. So unfortunately what happens is people do discharge it, but they discharge it by screaming at other people, by physically releasing it, right? By internalizing until they feel like they're going to combust. So there's all of these ways that people try to cope with it, but they don't have the tools to actually move that energy through in a safe way. Or we may see people get stuck on off, where they shut down and they become dissociative, or they feel very lethargic, or very just too full to do anything. And in that state, we often want to stimulate and help people kind of come up and upregulate out of that state. And we'll look at some resources for doing that today. So the other thing that we look at is understanding the function of the behaviors that we see. So if somebody's cutting, for example, or using alcohol or drugs, I want to understand, are they using alcohol and drugs because they have excessive energy, right? And too much pain or fear or whatever it is? What do you think they gravitate if that's the case? What would they gravitate to? So I have too much pain, too much activation in my body. What type of drug might they gravitate to? Any guesses? Yeah, alcohol. Yeah, usually something that's going to bring that arousal level down. A depressant, right? Something that's going to numb. Opiates, yes, because they're going to numb, right? And kick in our natural painkillers. They might gravitate towards a stimulant because we have this built-in threshold where our brain says, you know, I'm only going to let you stay in this state of tremendous pain for so long before it actually sends us into this shutdown state, right? And it will only leave us in that shutdown kind of numb state for so long before it says, that's enough of that, I'm not ready to be dead, right? Or feel dead. And so that's where the oscillating kind of pattern tends to happen. So really what we want to understand is, you know, what is the use doing for them? What is the cutting doing? What is the eating disorder behavior doing? Whatever it is it, you know, releasing excess energy, right? Or is it stimulating them out of that shutdown state? So if somebody's shut down, they'll tend to gravitate towards a stimulant, right? So something that's going to bring that arousal level up. And again, if they go too far up, they might use a depressant to level out, right? And ultimately what they're doing without even knowing it is trying to get back to that optimal arousal zone. They just often don't have the tools to be able to do so. Does that make sense? So our job, and we also know that trauma, as Sue said earlier, really starts to shrink that optimal arousal level. So, you know, it really is formed in the earliest years of our life. That's the basis of it. In utero, in the first, second, and third year of life. That's our nervous system is growing and developing. The emotional regulation, so our HPA stress access, the orbital ventral medial areas of the brain, all of that ties in with our ability to regulate later in life. So when we look at somebody who really can't, it's often tracing it back to understand what happened in those earliest years. And you know, when you said that you don't have PTSD, that's great. There are lots of veterans that don't. But the feature is, at least the ones that I've worked with, and other professionals I've worked with, quite often if we trace their histories back, the ones that do are the ones that have the trauma histories, right, from childhood. So they've almost got that predisposition, they've got that window of tolerance that is smaller, and that means the amygdala is the part of the brain that kindles the most easily, so once it activates that much more easily, just like wood that kindles easily. So once we've had that activation, that window narrows and narrows, and it takes less and less for us to kind of flip our lid. Does that make sense? Okay. So we know trauma is a sensory experience because both brain hemispheres are affected. So I touched on this a little bit earlier, but essentially right hemispheres are sight, sound, smells, sensations of touch, emotional memory. That also is where trauma is stored. So it's the body that stores trauma. And this is why we get kind of stuck energy in the body that builds up when we start having chronic pain, or, you know, our health breaks down. Like we look now longitudinally at trauma, and the research is showing us it ties in with everything: cancer, heart disease, stroke, mental health as well, absolutely, but it also ties in with the physical health stuff. And how could it not, right? Because it's building and compounding. So left hemisphere is that higher order, logical, rational part of our brain. So it likes 1 + 2 = 1 + 2 = 3. So usually I say 2 + 2 = 4, so I threw myself off because I was like, 1 + 3 does not equal 4. So that's that logical part of my brain, though, that just kicked in and stopped me from mathematically adding that up in a wrong way. But the grammar didn't get stopped. So that's that analytical part of our brain, and that's what it does. It gives sequence, it gives logic, and when we're working with sexual assault victims, this is so important because this is part of the problem. Is they get interviewed and their statement is not sequential, right? Our memory typically is, but when it comes to stuff like this, trauma is not stored the same way. It's not retrieved the same way. The details that we attune to are not the details often that the police are asking. They're details that were central to survival. So my brain in that moment hyper attunes to whatever it perceives is most relevant to survival. And that may mean I'm going to watch the wall while this abuse is happening, and I can't even tell you what the person looked like, right? And that's just what we understand of our brain. So the first thing that we understand that happens with trauma is these two parts of our brain that are generally integrative and communicating back and forth to one another actually stop communicating. There's a disruption in the corpus callosum, or our information highway. And, you know, the example of this would be maybe I had a really bad car accident and I'm having an experience that's similar, and it reminds me of that, my whole body starts firing as though this whole thing is happening again. If there's no crosstalk between those hemispheres, even though maybe my car has stopped, right? If there's no crosstalk, I'm going to respond and react as though that has happened, right? And totally flip my lid. If there's crosstalk, then that left hemisphere, higher order part of my brain is going to say, oh, I know what this is, right? It reminds you of this, but it's okay. It's all right. And then whew, the arousal drops down and we can move into the breath or whatever's needed to kind of calm that arousal level. Does that make sense? Okay. We talked a little bit about the hand-brain model earlier as well, but this is just a visual. So again, we know that our brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. The earliest development is entirely dependent on our caregiver relations and interactions with us, as well as life experiences. So medical trauma, birth complications, like all of those things factor in. Trauma during mom's pregnancy, all of those factor in and impact the way that our brain grows and develops. So with the hand-brain model, this is Dan Siegel's model, he says, you know, this would be like our spinal cord, and then this would be the base, so our brain stem. This is the first part of the brain to grow and develop, and that's our fight, flight, freeze, survival-driven. Also our autonomic behaviors, right, which is why this is so critical, the breath work that Lisa does with the yoga, because quite often this is where people who've experienced trauma are living, right? They're living in that fight, flight, freeze, and it throws off everything. Most people who've experienced trauma can't do breath work. They feel like they're going to have a panic attack if you try to introduce breath work, because they're living in that state of everything's tight, everything's tense, everything's looking for alert, right? So that's where the breath work is so, so critical. Then we have the midbrain, which is also a key part that's active during trauma. And that's our hippocampus is there, so emotional learning and memory. We've got our amygdala, which is our security guard, and then you've also got your limbic system, which is our emotional regulatory system at the highest level. And what we know is really, this is boss, right? The limbic system is boss, amygdala is boss. And that higher order part of our brain that we all like to work with, that's involved with cause and effect thinking and logic and reason and willpower and rationalization, is the last part of the brain to grow and develop. And research is actually showing us that for females, I think the research is saying late 30s, and males into our 40s, this is still growing and developing. But we want children to be responding with sequence and logic and order in an irrational way, and they really just can't. Right? And a lot of the adults who have experienced trauma also just can't. It's not that they won't, they just can't, right? So what happens is that arousal activation becomes big down here in the brainstem and in the midbrain, and it actually causes us to flip our lid and lose access to logic, reason, rationalization, cause and effect, all of the wonderful strategies we practice in therapy, and they're just gone, right? So our work really is treating this underlying issue that's causing the big fear activation to begin with. And it typically isn't the adult stuff. It's typically the childhood stuff that takes up the most space, which shrinks that window of tolerance so that we have less room for the day-to-day stuff, right? So people often want to work on the day-to-day, and we'll always trace it back, right, to the earliest they remember experiencing certain things. Once we clear that, it is amazing how even when they're living with being evicted or being homeless or still being assaulted or, you know, real life trauma recurring over and over, once we've cleared up that space and helped them have tools to regulate, the day-to-day stuff becomes more manageable. Yeah. This is just a quick brain analogy. So this is, I just have a few more and then I'll be done. Bessel van der Kolk gives this brain analogy that I think is really helpful. So he says the amygdala, I call it a security guard, he calls it an alarm detector. Same thing, it determines whether the information coming in is relevant to survival, right? And if it views that it is relevant to survival, it kicks those higher order regions offline because, and this is what we condition veterans to do, by the way, because they can't be in that thinking part of their brain. It's too slow. Think about how we hem and haw and contemplate things when we're in that part of our brain. We change our mind, you'd be dead, right? We need to be in this survival-driven, fight, flight, freeze, you know, automatic limbic system part of our brain, and there's a conditioning process that allows that to happen. The thalamus is the cook. So it takes in all of the information from our senses, all of the sensory input, and helps us stir it around and form a coherent representation of it. So we're meant to be able to say, this is what is happening to me, right? The medial prefrontal cortex, that's that higher order part of the brain, is meant to be our watchtower, and it's meant to help us discern. So it's meant to help me kind of use those higher order skills to reflect on what's happening and respond accordingly. But again, the moment we detect that danger, our brain, actually, the systems break down and stop with that integration, and we become, as van der Kolk says, like conditioned animals. He says the moment we detect danger, we automatically go into fight or flight mode. And then he says in PTSD, it's the critical balance between the amygdala, the smoke detector, and the medial prefrontal cortex, which shifts, causing it to making it harder for people to control their emotions and impulses. And then he says intense emotions cause people to take leave of their senses. And you've all seen that. You've all dealt with somebody at some point in time, and you've been trying to talk or rationalize with them, and you just can't, right? They're not in that state. So this is exactly why. It's the brain circuitry, right? They flipped their lid. And he says what we need to do is achieve a balance between the medial prefrontal cortex and the midbrain and the amygdala in particular, using bottom-up or top-down approaches. So bottom-up is generally where we start. If we flipped our lid, the top-down stuff is not going to be typically as effective. So if I want to start with thinking and rationalizing is offline, what are you working with, right? So trying to talk people down when they're stressed like that is generally not going to be so effective. Pitch, tone, cadence of voice might, right? If it's been drilled in there that response is what they respond to, then it will, right? But it just varies. But typically we're going to start with the bottom up. So we're going to use things like breath work, movement, yoga, sensory discharge work, art, right? Things that are sensory in nature. So we're working with that sensory part of the brain where the trauma is to regulate the mind and the brain. The top down is using the mind and the brain to regulate the body and the nervous system. And we can only do that if it's online, right? So I had a little one that came in once with really big anger, and he had been dropped off and I was working off site, so I didn't have any of the cool resources we have at our center. And he started to become activated because he had really bad things happen to him at home, and he was in care, and his mom said to him, there was court coming up, and she said, don't you talk to that therapist. And so this sweet little thing that we had really good rapport came in, and I could just see he was just teeming with energy. You could see it all over his face, his body. I said, how are you today, I wonder? And he said, my mom said I'm not supposed to talk to you. And I wrongly said, here's the talk. I wonder how that makes you feel, or I started to say something like, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I wonder how that makes you feel. I didn't even get 2 words out before he screamed at me, my mom said I'm not supposed to talk to you. Exactly what he had just told me, right? So I tried to use a top down. Now, it would have been integrative because I would have been looking at the feelings, so it would have been tapping into the body, but rightly so, he didn't want to talk. So here I am sitting in my office. If I had, or not in my office, if I had essential oils, I might have used those. If I had our singing bowl, I might have played that. I didn't even have my phone. It was in the car because I didn't need it. I was just there for an hour. So instead what I did is I just started humming. Just something random, right? Humming regulates our nervous system. And within seconds, this little boy looked at me and his eyes filled with tears. And he said, I'm sorry, Lori. I didn't mean to yell at you. And I said, hey, it's okay, right? I don't want you to do anything your mommy doesn't want you to do. But I also think that you like coming here. So I wonder how that feels for you, right? So that bottom up was something that allowed him to shift very, very quickly out of that state, like seconds, right? And that's what I really want to emphasize is the tools and techniques that we look at. It takes seconds to shift affect, seconds. Doesn't have to be a big long process. So it's just giving people those tools to shift that wave or the intensity of it so it's not so overwhelming. With the trauma processing model we use, it's integrative, so we're bilaterally stimulating the brain, but ultimately what we're doing is depotentiating the memory. So we're working through it in a safe, structured way. Trauma disrupts the consolidative capacity of our brain, so the ability to take a memory and put it away in proper space and time because of the charge, because of the disruption to the sequence, because of the disruption to memory. So this process helps people to become more embodied around that experience, process the sensory stuff, and it's not going deep. We don't go deep into anything. We don't need to. I don't even need to know the details of what happened for this model. But it is tapping into at a sensory level, which is very automatic, what's stuck there, what's trapped in the body, right? And that stuff comes out really, really quickly. And then it's about playing it through to the end, right? And this is where understanding that arousal activation is so key. So quite often we'll look at, what scared you most at the time? Well, I thought I was going to die. And I've worked with many veterans who have said this to me. And I'm talking about, I worked with vets who are in Vietnam. I had 2 in Vietnam. That was a long time ago, right? And they have been living in this active state of I'm going to die for like 50 years, 60 years, right? Like really. And, so the question then becomes, did you die? And their eyes get so big and they're like, no. And it's like the first time that their brain and their body has consciously registered the fact that they didn't die, right? The threat was real. Well, not necessarily in that situation. I'm thinking the person that came, well, yeah, he had a lot, the one that I was thinking of, but that's a common theme, right? Is that fear of dying. And when we ask, did you die? Quite often there's this like light bulb that goes off because the amygdala is still, there's threat. And that's what it's looping in, right? And we've got to shift it out of that. Or there's shame, right? And the shame is being perpetuated, but there's fear that underlies that shame. So it's understanding kind of what is presenting for them. The other strategy we use a lot is name it to tame it. So it's on your first slide as well, that as emotions come up, we want to notice it, right? What is it that's there? We're not judging it, we're not analyzing it, we're not rejecting it, it's stuffing it down, we're noticing it. So we notice it, name it, right? What is it? Anger, fear, sadness, uneasiness, right? What is it? We're going to allow it to be there as part of the human experience. So often we feel sadness or anger and we just want to make it go away, right? But really, I want people to be able to feel their feelings and not destabilize, not become flooded by intense emotions, not shut down and dissociate, but recognize that anger is just part of being human, right? And we can feel anger without freaking out on other people. We can feel anger without falling apart, right? We can feel sadness without falling apart. It's being able to notice what's there and not kind of be pulled under by that big wave. And then we consider, how can we nurture this? How can we tend to it? If nurture is too soft, how can we respond to it, right? What does this feeling need? And it's not looking at the physical, it's looking at emotionally, what do I need when I feel shame? What do I need when I feel like, oh, I can't believe I did that? What do I need when I feel insecure? And can you offer that to yourself, right? So in this moment, I notice fear is arising, fear is a part of the human experience, and may I be kind to myself in this moment, right? It's part of being human. We also do reframing, which is important from that false alarm perspective. So consider, is it true? Is it real? Is it proportionate to what is happening right now? Is it kind, right? And I'll often ask, where's the proof? So the false alarms typically don't have proof, right? It's old stuff that's being triggered in the present moment. And when we step back to kind of look at, okay, let's look at this. Let's investigate it a little bit. What's happening right here and now, right? So maybe there's activation and I'll say, are you safe in this moment? And again, I think of another veteran that I worked with much younger, but he was having fear activation in my office. And I said, are you safe in this moment? And he looked at me. And I said, is anybody in this space right here in my office physically, sexually, emotionally, or otherwise trying to harm you? And he said, well, no. I said, okay, are you safe in this moment, right? So we need to be really literal because the amygdala is very black and white, right? You're either safe or unsafe, you're alive or you're dead. But there's a whole gray area in between there. And not when we're out on the battlefield, right? That's different. And that's what I'm saying. We need to be able to learn how this is one piece, and there is very real threat and danger there, but there's not that same danger at home, right? There's not that same danger when we're out in the community necessarily. And it's helping our brain to kind of understand that and tease through that. So our goal is really to integrate right and left hemisphere, and typically we need to reduce the arousal in the right hemisphere first so that we can then bring that left hemisphere back online, and then we can use and integrate those strategies. So I just wanted to do a little exercise on smell, and then the rest are just kind of some slides that talk about different oils and their benefits. And yeah, I don't know if I can print a copy of this or email you a copy of it so that you've got kind of the handout format just for your own reference. But yeah, you'd like it, Sue?
Well, I just need for the group, you know, to have your
Yeah, I just didn't want to print it for everybody because it would have been a lot of printing, and that little printer was tired.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll send it in a handout format, but you'll be able to read it. So our sense of smell is actually highly linked with threat detection. Highly linked, our olfactory systems. It also is an incredibly fast resource for grounding. Smell is the fastest way to get to the thinking part of our brain, right? To, you know, shift affect. So we use essential oils regularly in our office, and you have some different oils on the table there. The idea behind scent, though, is finding what is grounding and soothing, right? Some smells will be activating for some people, some will be aversive, some will be soothing, and it's finding what are those tools. So, and I have many clients that they'll wear the diffuser bracelets, including my men, will wear the diffuser bracelets because they'll put the essential oils on them and they can smell them. They're lava rock, and they can smell them between session, because just even moving their arms brings a sense of that oil past their nose, and there's an association formed in their brain that, oh, this is good, this is soothing, right? And so their affect shifts just through the smell. So what I'm going to invite you to do, I'm not going to go through the neuroscience of smell, it's in the handouts more for your awareness, but this just looks at some of the different oils and the benefits of them. What I will emphasize though is sensory distraction. Anytime we're using our senses, sight, sound, smell, sensation of touch, right? All of those things are really great for shifting that affective state. So if you're trying to move somebody out of an uncomfortable or an activated or even a shutdown state, right? So if Lisa were shut down on me or dissociative or non-responsive, smell is a great way to stimulate, right? Movement is a great way to stimulate, but I can't pick her up and move her. But I can open up a bottle of oils, put it in front of her, put some on my hands, which naturally brings it into the air, and that's automatically going to shift affect. My voice, right? The pitch, tone, cadence of my voice is affect, just like the humming with the little boy, right? So there's lots of ways we can use our senses, and of course nature is the greatest regulator we have, and you guys we're surrounded by mountains and nature, and you know, oh my gosh, it is tremendous. So really tranquil. Just even stepping outside and feeling the air or breathing in the air on our face shifts, right? Absolutely it does. Sitting down. So like I said, these are the different oils, and I'm not going to go through them, but I do want to go through a sensory relief activity. So all I'm going to ask you to do, we're not going to do the worksheet, but I'm just going to ask you to kind of notice what you're feeling in your body right now. It's late-ish, it's 8:20. So just kind of tuning in for a minute, not judging, not analyzing, just noticing what's there. Are you tired? Are you interested? Are you bored? Are you, you know, full? Like what's there, right? And you don't have to share, but just notice. And then I'm going to invite you to try out some of the different oils. So just, you can take the lid off, breathe them in, notice what ones you like. If you find one you don't like, move on to another one. Pass them down so Anne-Marie can play too.
Thank you.
Right? So notice the one that you liked. Because what happens if we come to one we don't like, then I'll say, okay, go back to one that you did like. We now know that this is one you don't like so much. It's all right. No, see, and now go back to, was that Forgive? Which one was that you didn't like, or Cheer? What's it say?
This one was Forgive.
Yeah, Forgive is a little more earthy. I really like it, but.
Is that when you want to forgive yourself or forgive someone else?
No. It's the Emotional Aromatherapy Kit. This is one of my favorite kits.
Yeah, did everybody get peace?
No, I never got peace. I can sure use
It's
peace.
coming down the table.
Okay. I got cheer though.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Cheer's the one I like.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
I have not, I've not smelled
Cheer is quite lovely.
I'd love to try
So go
peace.
back to the one that you liked as we.
Cheers. I think you did cheer because you passed it to me.
Yeah. And Cheer is called Cheer because it generally does cheer people up, right?
I'm gonna
So, orange, right? Bergamot, those are smells that generally are uplifting.
Peace.
Peace.
Okay, peace.
I love the Console one. It is my
That is-
favorite.
Which one do you like?
I love it.
That's interesting. I thought I would like it. And I was like,
But that's where we're
I keep
all
going
different.
Always to
Yeah.
console.
Mhm, I love it. So go back to the one that you like and just breathe that in again.
This is cheer.
And your
Okay, I like
face,
Cheer.
your face says you didn't like that one.
Dave
right?
needs peace.
Okay.
I'm passing peace down for Dave. Yeah.
He likes Cheer. I think Cheer was his favorite.
You tried
Oh,
See, but their sense of smell is so much stronger,
Yeah.
right? And oils are strong.
Did you see him jump?
That was yes.
He
Yeah.
just did not like that at all.
So
yeah, I need to learn how to peace or so much.
when you go back to the one that you like,
Where's peace at?
This is the one I like.
piece is down here. Can we,
Oh,
Lisa,
you
can you
like
pass
it?
that down?
I like
Yeah.
motivate.
Oh,
There you go.
no, I like motivate too, Renee.
Put a little on your wrist, and then you can share.
Right, I need to be motivated tonight. I need to sleep.
But if it calms you, it may help you to sleep, right? Just
Ooh, I
because
do like
something's
motivate.
stimulatory doesn't mean that it will be stimulatory for you.
Cheer, right?
Yeah, I've smelled them all, but I think I like Motivate the best.
Me too.
There you go.
We have three of
I
us
like
for
motivate
Two
too.
votes for motivate.
But
Yeah.
Console's my favorite,
Is
yes.
this motivate right here?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
minty.
It's sort of minty, yeah.
Yeah.
Wait,
What it tastes
and
like?
it is minty because
Did
it's
we
meant
It
to
smells like,
activate.
Did we bring a
it smells like a
diffuser with us?
peppermint mint.
No,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't.
Or, you know, the little, remember the York peppermint?
Yes, what I
Yes,
chocolate.
yes.
That's what exactly it smells
Exactly.
like.
Yeah,
This little
exactly.
beer smells like Toby. Get away.
Look at
What
you.
there?
What
Enjoy.
What are you doing?
Are you
That's-
getting
that's
served? What are you?
That's what I put on the.
Oh, you like that too.
That's what I put on the lava rock.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I can smell it. I love it.
It's sort of like Christmas in a way.
There you go. So just tune in for a minute and notice how you're feeling now. The same, different, anyone comfortable sharing?
Deeper breath. I know.
Deeper
just
breath?
Deeper
Yeah.
breath, you know? Just bring
I have a
it
deeper
in,
breath
suck
smelling it from over here.
Because all the stuff's in the air now.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm. Any other noticings? Whatever was in your body before, is it still there?
Yep.
What was there?
it
Can I
was
be curious?
just interested and,
Okay,
and just listening
okay.
and you know, not full, not empty, just
Yeah.
kind of
Just
content.
content, lovely.
So it's still there saying, but now I agree with this, the smelling deeper and
Yeah.
because the fragrance is in the air.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah. So more regulation. And usually what I would say is if anybody had pain or discomfort, the curiosity is did it shift, right?
Well, I
Did
had
it lessen?
a tightness in my stomach. It's just,
Mhm.
there's a lot of go, I can't help it. That's just who I am. I'm an anxious person. And not about anything particular, but it actually is lessened. Like I was
Yeah.
feeling a knot. Why do I have a knot in my stomach? But I do. And it's,
And I would say breathe into that knot in your stomach, right? And just let it be there. We want to get rid of it so often. If we just breathe into it, it's amazing how when we listen to our body, it actually shifts, right? Yeah. I say wrap it up like it's in a big hug. Talk to it like you would Toby when the lightning started last night. I said, it's okay. It's all right. And he was just good with that, right? He needs that. We all need that. Yeah. All right. So the idea would be to keep track of what are the smells that are soothing for you. And there's lots of other ones out there. I like this kit because it's a blend and it's specifically to emotional aromatherapy. It is expensive, but at the same time, therapeutic grade oils are expensive and you get 6 of them. So, yeah. And then the other piece I was going to teach you about, which I'm not going to do tonight, is how to use some of the neurofeedback and biofeedback. So I brought some different materials basically that you can play with in your own free time if you want to. I know Sue's like, because we like it. It's fun and regulating, but yeah, so maybe I'll build in some time just as people, if anyone has an interest in learning about that. The neurofeedback is great for rebalancing brain waves. And we have a pretty, basic system that we use. There's mindfulness meditation with the Muse. So this is great for, again, training the brain to a state of calm, but really user-friendly. Actually, a lot of my veterans really like this one too. It's a brain sensing headband. You put it on and it just coaches you through breath work with like the sound of waves or the sound of the rainforest. They typically, the ones I've worked with haven't liked the rainforest sound, but they like the waves. So that's that. Mind Lift is the home neurofeedback training. And then there's biofeedback training, which is the heart math. And basically what it does is it clips onto your earlobe. It measures your pulse and your heart rate and your breath. And then it also looks at the coherence between your emotional affective state. So what's the messages you're sending, your heart, and your breath, right? And all of that together. And we now know that our heart sends more messages to our brain than our brain sends to our head. Than our brain sends to our heart, which, is pretty phenomenal because our brain is very complex, but so is the heart. So learning how to shift what we're feeling in here actually changes energetically what's happening, but it also changes what's happening with our breath and the coherence. And we also have binaural beats. This is awesome. So a lot of the veterans I work with have trouble, well, and trauma in general, have trouble sleeping, have night terrors, right? Have trouble falling asleep, staying asleep. So Sync Tuition is binaural beats, and it is, you put on headphones and it's sound layering and it travels right, left, right, left. I listen to it all the time. I was listening to it last night. I listen to it on the plane. It's great for blocking out background noise, and I just find it so fabulous. And this one is set to train the brain to a state of increased awareness, but what I particularly love is it targets gamma brain waves, which are associated with joy and bliss. So when we're in an active trauma state, quite often joy is something that is just completely foreign. So this is a great way to kind of guide people into that experience in a titrated way and bring about a shift. So we also have a mindfulness program where you can listen to guided meditations. They're about 5 minutes of the neuroscience where they tell you the why of the program, which I love. So that appeals to that thinking part of the brain. And then 5 minutes of guided meditation. So all of these are on the tablet over there, but you will need help to know how to use them. Some of them are with the computer and the tablet together. So yeah, any questions about any of that?
I do.
Yeah.
So you're talking about things happening as you're growing up and your trauma or your tolerance level shrinking.
That window of tolerance, yeah.
What if it's, all these kids nowadays are being offended by everything.
Yes.
And they can't tolerate anything anymore without screaming and being violent.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a big thing today.
Yeah. Do you know how old are they?
Anywhere from teenagers to
29,
30 years old.
So do you know what happened 29, 30 years ago and still is happening that I think has really drastically impacted our affect regulation? We had a whole societal shift where it was okay to leave babies to cry. And the brain science now shows us that leaving babies to cry actually sends them into dorsal vagal shutdown. Basically,
Fertilizing babies?
Right. They're incredibly overwhelmed. They don't know how to self-regulate. Babies are entirely dependent on their caregivers to soothe them. And when they don't, there's this tremendous pain, and it actually is the roots of dissociation. So when we look at the amygdala stuff, right? Even though maybe I'm a loving, attuned parent otherwise, that leaving babies to cry has actually created, I think, a massive society of incredibly dysregulated individuals. We also have done timeouts. And again, we do the best that we can with what we know, but we now have the brain science that is showing us what exactly this does to the developing brain and to the nervous system. And we have this analogy of, you've got a dysregulated child who has no clue how they're feeling. We take them and sit them on a chair or on a step to self-regulate, which they don't know how to do. And then we wonder why when they're teenagers, they're going to the room when we're trying to sort out a big deal with them. They've learned, I need to work on this myself, right? I need to take care of it myself. They don't know how to. So what do? They gravitate towards drugs, sex, cutting. You know, they have short fuses. They flip their lid really easily. You know, plus trauma is common, right? You know, 1 in 4 experiences trauma. So that keeps people more activated too.
Yeah, but most people that experience trauma, I mean, it
Depends.
seems-
Some will be explosive and some will be very submissive. It really depends.
So I'm looking at it, you see these young college kids
Yeah.
and high schoolers,
Yeah.
they can't tolerate anything
Yeah.
anymore. If you don't agree with them, then you're wrong, and they're so,
But there's no
can't-
flexibility to their thought process,
Right.
right? So you're talking about that higher order
Right.
part of their brain
So-
is not as developed.
So even it may be almost self-induced trauma from growing up. I mean, self-induced meaning, you know, like you say, you know, crying or time out or.
Yeah, it may also be witnessing their parents being abused, or medical trauma, or physical, sexual, emotional abuse, attachment dysregulate. Like there's so many different things. But what's really fascinating, and this is the work that Sue and I do, is when we look at the behaviors and characteristics, you can learn a whole lot about where did those come from, and then we can treat that root. And it's amazing to see how it shifts those behaviors, right? So when I see somebody who's really combative like that, where did they learn that they need to fight to be heard, right? And it might just be that their voice isn't heard at home. Maybe they have 8 siblings, right? And they're the youngest, and it's not that somebody's ignoring them, but just that, you know, their voice doesn't factor in the same way. So I'm always curious about, like, where does this come from?
I think, for example, we started giving out participation trophies
Yeah.
20 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay? So if you just show up, you deserve something.
Yeah.
Instead of, and life's not that way.
Motivation, yeah.
Life is not that way. You know,
Yeah.
you have to earn it. You have to,
Give them everything.
you know, it's not just participation, but it's actually, you
Yeah.
know, you need to win. If you want something, you
Yeah.
need to win.
And work hard for it.
You know, I see that and okay.
I see societal role in it as well, I do.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I
Yeah,
know what you're saying, but
absolutely.
I also see that we have created it by giving them so much.
Too much.
making things
Too
so
much.
easy,
Yeah, they have. They've
spoiling
gotten too much.
them, letting them think they should have everything.
Yep.
You know, a sense of entitlement. So I see both. I see all of it. It's just, it's
And
a
that was
recipe
part of
for
that societal
disaster.
change, though, right?
Yeah, no,
Because that was part of the societal
We wanted
change
to
where
give
it
our
went
kids
from
everything.
a parent's bill of rights to a child's bill of rights, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you had a generation of children that became very self-absorbed. But again, when they don't have that attunement happening in early childhood, it makes sense that they become self-absorbed.
Yeah, from a
So,
reproductive
yeah.
standpoint, I was just going to go back to the brain science where we know 5/6 of the brain is built in that first year. So if you don't have an emotional brain that's built well, that's 5/6. Imagine building a house. 5/6 of the foundation isn't there. You're going to end up with big cracks, right? It's going to be the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's going to go down, and that's what happens. So when you think of all the things that happened over the last, 2-3 decades, women entering the workforce, nothing against that, but
Massive
It
changes.
was massive changes, and if, as a human species, we are primed in the same way
We're wired
animals
to
are.
connect.
We're wired to connect, but we're primed for attention, for attunement and attachment, right? You look at animals, and if they're not licked and they're not connected, they don't have that secure attachment. Their nervous system is wired in a different way. So those early pieces, when people come in, it's never about the behaviors or diagnosing, it's what happened to you. Tell me about your life history, that historical timeline. And we can understand from that developmental standpoint, what was missing, what did they need, what wasn't there. The coolest thing, and the most hopeful message of all of this, though, is that our brain and bodies want to...
Coyotes.
Oh,
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
no, thank you for hearing that. I didn't even hear that. Interesting. But I always go back to the most hopeful message is that our brain is plastic. We know about the neuroplasticity in that it wants to heal. Our bodies want to heal. And so when we do this integrative stuff with our mind, body, spirit, it is mind-blowing. When we talk about spontaneous remissions, some people call them miracles. But a lot of times spontaneous remissions are when we connect the mind and body and spirit together. And there's been countless stuff written in the spiritual literature as well as in mind-body science. But a lot of that going right back to the emotional brain, and when pieces are missing, we can see with much more clarity and without blaming or shaming.
Well, the behaviors make sense. They're adaptive, survival-driven, protective behaviors that made sense at that time, but not necessarily now, right? And thank you for sharing. Like what Sue shared is what I generally teach in our core training, but I'm already over my time. But what is really important to note about the point that she said about 5/6 of our brain growth and development, that is directly attachment driven. So it's important for you to understand that it is dependent on our interactions with our caregivers, and that's huge, right?
That's
So
why kids living with a nanny 70% of the time.
And a nanny that's not attuned. Like I want to do a whole workshop to train nannies on attunement, right? Because they're with kids, and it doesn't mean that they know how to have that healthy attachment. So there's so many societal things that I think tie in, but I think we need to be able to trace stuff back and understand where does it come from, and recognize maybe it served a purpose at that time from a survival-driven perspective or an attachment perspective, but does it still serve a purpose now? Right? So when we're like in this huge activation and combative with anybody, where does that come from? And it makes sense, but does it make sense now? Is it serving you? Is it moving you forward or keeping you stuck? Right? So any other questions? Because I'm way over my time. All right, awesome. So that's it. And yes, I generally present on this for a full day. So 2 days, 3 days.
That'd be great.
Why don't we just do 10 minutes tonight, because it's really just